The cold stone floor of the Ashmere Sanctum leached the warmth from her boots, but Mara Vale did not shift her weight. She stood in the furthest alcove of the frost-rimmed gallery, an iron-wrought desk, acting as her sole barrier against the gathered crowd. Before her lay the Ashmere Registry ledger, its vellum pages crackling faintly in the dry winter air. Silence was a kind of armor, thinner than most, but lighter to carry. Mara wore it perfectly. She dipped her iron-nibbed quill into the dark inkwell, tapping the edge twice to prevent a blot. She kept her posture immaculately straight, aligning her spine with the vertical columns of the text. She was the Pact's chief scribe, a wolfless woman, tolerated only because her mind held the structural memory of generational pacts. The sanctum smelled of melting tallow and the cloying sweetness of winter rose incense the bride had specifically demanded. Mara adjusted the woolen shawl over her shoulders, focusing on that mundane friction rather than the rhythmic chanting of the pack elders. Their voices rose in a unified hum, sealing a union built on opportunistic betrayal. Rowan Vance stood at the altar, his broad shoulders draped in the ceremonial furs of a future pack leader. His resonant voice echoed off the vaulted ceilings, declaring his absolute fidelity. Eveline Grey looked radiant, wrapped in winter-white silks, her posture radiating a victory she had long sought to secure. Mara did not watch the kiss. She watched the ledger. Her gaze fell upon the current page, tracing the drying ink of the preliminary lineage declarations. Near the upper margin, she spotted it, a tiny grease smudge, left behind by Rowan's thumb when he had carelessly touched the parchment to sign the intent of union an hour prior. It felt like a quiet insult to the pristine nature of the administrative record. Mara set her quill down with deliberate slowness. She pressed the edge of her thumbnail against the vellum, her knuckles whitening slightly under the strain of physical control. Carefully, methodically, she scraped the grease from the page. It took 3 measured strokes. Her hands remained perfectly steady. The physical world demanded her attention, and she gave it freely to the task of preserving the law, distancing herself from the theater below. Once the smudge was gone, she picked up her writing instrument once more. The dark fluid set quickly in the freezing draft. She documented the formal exchange of the mating rings, transcribing the exact phrasing mandated by tradition. She alone owned the history being recorded in the shadows. Down at the altar, the chanting ceased. The heavy, ceremonial silence that followed was designed to let the weight of the oaths settle over the witness circle. In this deliberate quiet, Rowan broke the protocol of the sacred rite. He turned his head away from his new bride. He looked up toward the shadowed gallery. He was searching for her. Mara felt the heavy pressure of his gaze, sweeping over the iron desk, cutting through the dim light of the upper alcove. He expected a breakdown. He had spent the last week wearing a mask of false pity, offering weak justifications about pack hierarchy. He wanted the validation of her visible grief to absolve his guilt. She offered no such satisfaction. Instead, she met his stare with the stillness of a compass needle finding north. Her expression was utterly blank, a flat, unreadable surface that offered him nothing. Slowly, deliberately, she broke eye contact to adjust the angle of her ink pot. She nudged the heavy glass vial a fraction of an inch to the left, catching a narrow beam of pale winter light. She dipped her quill, ignoring his existence entirely. Rowan's jaw tightened. Even from the elevated balcony, Mara could see the subtle stiffening of his shoulders, the frustrated twitch of his gloved hands. He had wanted a public tragedy to make himself feel important. Instead, he got an auditor. Forced by the silence of the sanctum, he turned back to Eveline. "I offer my lineage, my protection, and my territory." Eveline began, her voice ringing out with practiced theatricality. She raised her chin, projecting her words to the farthest corners of the hall. "I bind my blood to the Vance bloodline, and in doing so, I grant my mate full stewardship over the sovereign leased timberlands of the eastern ridge." Mara's hand stopped hovering. The quill remained suspended a millimeter above the parchment. She blinked, processing the exact phrasing of her cousin's vow. Sovereign leased timberlands. The Ashmere Pact did not own the eastern ridge. That land was legally bound to the crown, leased strictly to the reigning alpha, and could never be transferred through a subordinate contract. Eveline's words were a direct violation of ancient treaty laws. By claiming stewardship over that land, the bride was publicly executing an illegal land transfer clause. Mara let the realization settle into her chest like a stone dropping through still water, slow, thorough, filling every crack. The elders, blinded by the pageantry and the Vance family's recent influx of wealth, nodded along, entirely ignorant of the massive jurisdictional fraud being spoken into existence. They prized physical strength and shifted forms, leaving the tedious matters of law to the quiet scribe they ignored in the gallery. Without a change in her breathing, Mara lowered the nib to the vellum. She recorded Eveline's vow word for word. She did not paraphrase to protect her former family. She documented the exact, illegal transfer of royal land with immaculate penmanship, sealing the Ashmere Pact's arrogance in undyeable ink. The soft sound of her scratching quill was entirely drowned out by the sudden cheers of the crowd below. But it was the only sound that actually mattered. The iron grate of the sanctum hearth radiated a dry, stinging heat that settled heavily over Mara's knuckles. Behind her, the celebratory echoes of the mating feast bled through the heavy oak doors, a muffled rhythm of lute strings and clinking glass that belonged to a world she had just documented out of her own life. She stood perfectly still before the flames. In her right hand, she held a length of braided silver ribbon. It was the ceremonial binding cord Rowan had given her 3 years ago, stamped at the center with the Vance family crest in dark green wax. Another woman might have wept over it. Another rejected bride might have hurled the ribbon into the fire in a sudden, violent burst of grief. Mara did no such thing. She approached the destruction of the token with the same methodical precision she applied to the clan's primary record book, which now rested securely, clamped shut on the high-reading lectern across the room. She extended her hand toward the creeping flames, not tossing the fabric, but holding it deliberately just above the hottest coals. She watched the green wax begin to soften. It wept down the sides of the silver braid, slowly losing the sharp, arrogant edges of the crest. The scent of melting beeswax and bitter pine resin curled into the cold gallery air. It is a pathetic thing to linger by the ashes. The voice was sharp, carrying the unmistakable rasp of age and inherited authority. Isolde Grey stood in the archway of the gallery. The pack elder wore layered velvet, her chin angled upward in a posture designed to invite submission. Isolde had engineered the new marriage contract, gaslighting the council into believing Mara's wolfless nature made her unfit for a high-ranking union. She had come to the quiet room, expecting to find a broken woman crying over the coals. She wanted the satisfaction of offering false pity to the outcast. Mara did not turn around. She kept her eyes fixed steadily on the melting seal. "I am not lingering, Elder. I am ensuring the wax does not stick to the ironwork. It causes a terrible stench when the grates are cleaned." Isolde's footsteps clicked sharply against the flagstones as she stepped closer, visibly frustrated by the lack of hysterics. "You should not be here. It is customary for the displaced to remain out of sight during the feast. Have you no shame? Standing here like a ghost in your cousin's shadow? Eveline is Luna now. You would do well to remember that rank." "I have recorded it," she answered, her voice as flat and even as a slate-board. "The ledger is updated. The ink is already drying." The green wax finally gave way, dripping into the orange embers with a sharp hiss. Only when the heavy seal was entirely gone did Mara release the silver braid. The fabric caught the draft, flaring into brief, brilliant yellow fire before curling into brittle black soot. It was not a tragedy. It was simply a concluded transaction. Mara wiped a faint smear of soot from her thumb, using the edge of her dark linen skirt. She turned to face Isolde. She did not bow. She did not lower her gaze. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, until the older woman shifted uncomfortably on her feet. The gatekeeper occupied her status with volume. She did not know how to handle a person who wore silence like a wall of cold stone. "I am finished here," Mara said quietly, stepping past the elder without waiting for a formal dismissal. The archive office attached to the sanctum was as cold as a root cellar, smelling faintly of old parchment and damp plaster. Mara moved through the narrow room with practiced, unbroken efficiency. There was no hesitation in her hands as she pulled her single wooden trunk from beneath the writing desk. She had known this departure was inevitable the moment she saw the illegal land transfer clause drafted in Eveline's name. Survival in this territory required either a wolf or a willingness to blindly obey corrupt authority, and she possessed neither. She placed 3 woolen dresses, a pair of heavy winter boots, and a thick northern cloak into the trunk. Beside them, she packed her tools, 2 glass bottles of Iron-Gall ink, a bundle of fresh quills, and a leather-bound notebook containing her private translations of boundary law. She did not take the ceremonial silver inkwell the Pact had issued to her. She took only what she had purchased with her own copper coins. Moving to the desk, she pulled a fresh sheet of unsealed parchment from the upper drawer. She did not draft a letter of grievance. She did not write a plea for fairness, or a recounting of Rowan's betrayal. Those were emotional indulgences that could be mocked or ignored. Instead, she dipped her plain wooden pen and cited the 3rd statute of the Ashmere Service Code. Effective upon the closing of the current registry, I release myself from the administrativitude of this pack. No outstanding debts are held. No further labor will be provided. She signed her name at the bottom in strict, unornamented script. The sharp scratch of the quill against the paper was the loudest sound in the freezing room. She folded the parchment twice, sealing it with plain, unmarked white wax, and left it dead center on the wooden desk, where the elders could not miss it. The final task remained. Mara reached into the deep pocket of her apron and withdrew the heavy brass key to the archives. For 7 years, that piece of metal had been her only tether to safety in a community that despised her humanity. She held it for a brief moment, feeling the familiar, worn grooves against her palm. She set the key down on the edge of the desk. Using her index finger, she nudged the brass bow until it aligned perfectly with the long, dark grain of the oak floorboards running parallel to the wall. It was a small, meticulous adjustment. She wanted them to find no chaos when they came looking for her. Her exit would be as orderly, as indisputable, and as flawless as her ledgers. Lifting the wooden trunk by its leather handles, she walked out into the freezing night. She had already paid a passing merchant to secure her a seat on the midnight supply wagon heading north. Her destination was a secluded, snowbound border station, a miserable outpost primarily used for processing trade disputes and maintaining the lonely edge of the sovereign territory. It was a place designed for the forgotten. For Mara, it offered the one resource she desperately needed to survive the coming winter: absolute, unquestioned isolation. The wagon jolted forward, its wooden wheels crunching loudly through the accumulating frost. Mara pulled her heavy cloak tighter around her shoulders, watching the warm, golden lights of the sanctum fade into the heavy grey storm. She did not look back again. 3 days into her isolation, the northern wind stripped the last remnants of warmth from the timber walls of the border station. The remote outpost was little more than a fortified way station, a decaying relic of forgotten trade routes that smelled perpetually of damp ash and aging pine resin. The cold radiating from the unsealed floorboards was absolute. It crept steadily through the thin leather soles of Mara Vale's boots and settled deep into her bones. But the profound silence the room offered was more than worth the physical toll. She had not travelled to this desolate sanctuary to weep over a broken engagement. She had come to work. A single, cheap tallow candle burned steadily on the scarred wooden table, casting a wavering, amber glow over dozens of scattered parchment sheets. Spread methodically before her were the transcribed rubbings of the ancient treaty slab, copied in secret from the lower archives before her quiet departure. She was translating a dialect that most modern Pact elders dismissed as ceremonial nonsense. For the wolfless scribe, it was the only architecture that mattered. It was a mathematical certainty in a world otherwise governed by biological whims, brute strength, and volatile Pact politics. The ambient temperature in the small room dropped further as the grey evening approached, turning her every exhalation into a faint white plume. Mara paused, setting her heavy brass-nibbed quill down on the cold lip of the inkwell. The Iron-Gall Ink was becoming visibly sluggish, thickening and pooling in the freezing air. She lifted her hands toward her mouth and blew warm, measured breaths over her stiff, aching fingers. She rubbed her cracked knuckles deliberately, forcing the sluggish blood back into the joints so they would not lock up entirely. Her personal physical comfort was irrelevant. The absolute legibility of her legal translations remained her singular priority. A single misplaced vowel or misinterpreted rune in the old dialect could alter a regional land grant by 50 miles or shift a massive tax burden onto starving villagers. She picked up the quill again, adjusting her grip to account for the stiffness in her wrist. The sharp, rhythmic scratch of the nib against the rough paper was the only sound permitted in the empty room. She focused entirely on unravelling the structural syntax of a 3rd century taxation clause. There was no space in her disciplined mind for the memory of the wedding gallery, no room left for the echo of the vows she had stoically recorded. Grief was a useless luxury she could not afford, and self-pity was a disease she simply refused to catch. The dark script set rapidly in the freezing climate, leaving no room for sorrow. By midnight she had successfully filled 3 new pages with precise, dense annotations under the pseudonym she had utilized for years. The silent quill existed only in these marginalia, a faceless, statusless ghost, correcting the profound legal errors of the ruling class from the frozen edge of the world. The rhythmic, heavy crunch of iron-shod boots against the frozen earth shattered the morning stillness. Mara did not jump, nor did she run to the frosted window glass to look outside. She simply laid her quill down, aligning it perfectly parallel to the inkwell, and waited in silence. The loud, aggressive snort of war horses and the distinct jingle of military bridles echoed sharply in the narrow courtyard below. The outpost keepers panicked. Stammering voice drifted up the wooden stairwell, only to be immediately silenced by a low, highly disciplined command. Heavy footsteps ascended the wooden stairs. They were unhurried, measured, and terrifyingly precise. The men approaching were obviously not local border guards. They carried the heavy atmospheric pressure of high-ranking wolves, their sheer physical presence pushing the stagnant air completely out of the narrow corridor. The heavy oak door swung open, bringing with it a sudden freezing draft and the sharp scent of ozone, polished steel, and fresh pine branches. 3 imposing soldiers stepped over the threshold, their dark armour proudly bearing the sovereign crest of the Winter Court. At their absolute centre stood Garrick Sterling. The guard commander wore a thick fur-lined cloak dusted with fresh snow, his large, gauntleted hand resting casually on the pommel of his broadsword. Mara stood up slowly from her wooden chair. She kept her posture perfectly straight, her ink-stained hands folded loosely in front of her coarse woolen skirt. She knew exactly why they had come. Her long-standing, unauthorized correspondence with the capital's archives had finally been traced to this location. Interpreting sovereign treaty law without an official Pact title or noble sponsorship was a severe administrative offense. She expected the cold bite of iron shackles. She fully expected the rough hands of soldiers dragging a rogue outcast into the unforgiving snow. Instead, the towering commander stopped abruptly. His sharp, calculating gaze swept the small freezing room, eventually landing on the floor. Because the desk was far too small to hold her work, Mara had laid her freshly inked manuscript pages across the bare floorboards to dry. Garrick's eyes tracked the meticulous, dense handwriting covering the scattered parchment sheets. He did not draw his weapon. He did not issue a barked, aggressive command to his subordinates. Moving with a deliberate, surprising grace for a man of his immense size, Garrick adjusted his heavy boots, stepping precisely and carefully between the drying pages. He navigated the narrow, bare spaces of the wooden floor to avoid smudging even a single drop of her work. It was an act of profound, unexpected administrative deference. "We are looking for the scholar known as the Silent Quill," the commander stated. His voice was a low, resonant rumble that demanded the truth without ever needing to threaten it. Mara did not flinch under the heavy weight of his scrutiny. "I am the author of those letters," she answered, her voice quiet but entirely steady. "I assume you have come to confiscate the transcriptions and exact the penalty." Garrick reached inside his heavy winter cloak, but he did not pull out a standard warrant for her arrest. He withdrew a thick roll of premium vellum, securely bound by a heavy gold ribbon and a massive beeswax seal stamped with the royal crest. He offered it to her, holding it out respectfully over the final row of drying ink. "I have come to escort you to the Winter Court," the guard commander corrected, his tone shifting into one of deep institutional respect. "By the direct writ of the sovereign king." Mara stood in the doorway of the freezing border outpost, the biting wind tugging at her wool shawl. Commander Garrick Sterling towered on the threshold, a mountain of dark iron and frost-tipped fur. He asked for the scholar, sending unauthorized corrections to the capital archives. For 3 years, she had corrected flawed translations, dispatching them as the Silent Quill. Unsanctioned alteration to royal records was high treason. Now, the ledger of her crimes was being called to account. "I am the author," Mara said. The admission hung in the icy air. She kept her hands steady, expecting the cold bite of iron manacles. She had packed only her inkstone and a few spare quills, preparing for the rough handling typical of an Ashmere arrest. She calculated how long she could survive the journey to the dungeons in her thin boots. Instead, Garrick stepped back, his heavy iron plates shifting with a dull clink. He brought a gauntleted hand to his chest and bowed. It was the deep, measured bow of a royal guard acknowledging a superior. "The Crown requests your immediate presence, scholar," the commander said, his voice carrying no threat. "Your transport has been prepared." Mara followed him into the snow. Waiting at the tree line was not a rusted iron wagon, but a massive enclosed carriage bearing the silver crest of the sovereign court. The massive wooden wheels were wrapped in boiled leather and iron rivets, an expensive modification designed to muffle the carriage over uneven frozen mud. She had read of this practice. It was a luxury reserved exclusively for the transport of royal intellectual guests, ensuring their writing would not be disturbed. The scent of cured oil and beeswax hit the frigid air, grounding her in reality. She was not a prisoner. She was a protected asset of the crown. Garrick opened the door himself, offering his forearm as a steady brace. Taking her seat on the velvet cushions, she let the knowledge settle into her like cold water into stone. The sovereign court valued the precise weight of her mind far more than the bloodline she lacked. The journey to the capital was a steady progression through the harshest northern terrain. The muffled turning of the wheels lulled her into a strange, suspended calm. When they finally rolled to a halt on the polished flagstones of the inner courtyard, the sun had dipped below the jagged horizon, casting the winter court in violet shadows. The fortress was a staggering monument of dark basalt and iron, engineered for endurance rather than display, far removed from the petty, wooden extravagance of the Ashmere Sanctum. Her escort guided her past heavily guarded outer gates and winding, torch-lit corridors. They bypassed the grand throne room, descending into the quiet, temperature-controlled heart of the fortress. The air grew drier. Smelling faintly of cedarwood and binding glue, they halted before iron-reinforced oak doors carved with the phases of the moon. The guards pulled the heavy wood open without a word, demanding no identification. Her escort was her proof of value. Mara crossed the threshold into the great hall of stone rolls. The sheer scale of the archive struck her like a physical blow. The air was perfectly still, carrying the rich scent of aged parchment, crushed rosemary, and cold stone dust. Row upon row of towering slate shelves stretched up into the vaulted ceiling, holding the collective legal history of the Northern Territories. The wealth of this room was entirely administrative. It was a fortress of recorded truth, preserved in ink and rock. She walked slowly down the central aisle, her plain boots making no sound. The profound quiet here felt like a woven shield, less rigid than iron, yet far less burdensome than the tense stillness she had maintained in her former pack. This stillness was protective, designed to outlast petty politics. She stopped before a massive section of the wall. She reached out, running her bare fingertips over the stone. It was freezing to the touch, yet it radiated a strange, grounding permanence. She traced the deep grooves of centuries-old compromises, feeling the exact points where ancient kings had laid down their swords in favor of binding contracts. It was a tangible record of men who understood that true power lay in the preservation of boundaries, not the reckless crossing of them. This was the machinery that held the realm together, ignored by those who only valued brute force. She leaned closer, her mind already analyzing the syntax of a broken passage near the bottom edge. She had spent her life watching arrogant men manipulate verbal oaths to steal land. Now, she stood in the center of the sovereign archives, her hands resting on the foundation of the crown's authority, finally free to read the uncorrupted truth. The great hall of stone rolls smelled of beeswax, dry dust, and ancient iron. As Mara's ink-stained fingers rested lightly against the ancient slate, the heavy door at the far end of the gallery swung inward. There was no herald. The man who entered did so with a quiet, unhurried grace that commanded the space through sheer restraint. Caelan Thorne wore a dark woolen tunic devoid of excessive ornamentation, the collar lined with a modest trim of winter fur. His footsteps on the stone were measured, producing no deliberate intimidation. He did not look at her with the predatory assessment common to most alphas. His gaze was analytical, reading her calm posture and the steady rhythm of her breathing. He carried a steaming cup of pine needle tea in his left hand. The faint scent of pine needles and hot steam cut through the musty air. As the sovereign approached the oak table, the scribe kept her chin level. Looking directly at an alpha was usually framed as insolence, but this was not the sanctum. The Alpha King closed the distance and set a ceramic cup down near her right hand. The heat radiating from the dark clay immediately warmed her numb knuckles. "The ride from the border is bitter this time of year," he said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that filled the quiet without breaking it. He simply offered the warmth as a practical necessity. She looked down at the fragrant liquid. The steam curled upward, a small, fragile living thing in the dead cold of the historical vault. She wrapped her fingers around the heated clay, letting the warmth seep into her skin. "Thank you," she murmured, her tone perfectly even. He remained standing, refusing to lean over the table to establish dominance. "You did not ask the guards why you were brought here," he noted, resting his hands casually on the wood. "I assumed the Crown's writ was clear," Mara answered. "Unplied interpretation of sovereign law is a serious offense. I expected to face a penal tribunal." His mouth twitched, the ghost of a smile vanishing instantly. The sovereign turned toward a linen-wrapped bundle resting on a nearby cart. "If I prosecuted every scholar, I would have no one to run the registries, but very few possess the precision of the silent quill." He folded back the heavy linen. Beneath the cloth lay a section of dark stone, its surface grooved with ancient lettering. It was a piece of the ancient treaty slab, the foundational legal document of the western borderlands. Recognizing the archaic syntax immediately, the scholar in her overrode the cautious exile. She set her cup down and moved closer, her eyes tracking the complex clauses etched into the rock. Kaelan watched her shift in focus, his expression softening with intellectual respect. He did not point to the sweeping declarations of territory. Instead, his gloved finger traced a line near the bottom of the slab, settling on a tiny, almost imperceptible groove. A single, archaic semicolon separated a clause regarding winter taxation from a mandate on emergency grain storage. 2 months ago, the Alpha King began, his tone shifting into the cadence of a legal historian. My council received an anonymous translation of this exact passage prior to that document arriving. The Western governors interpreted this sentence as a continuous mandate. They believed the Crown required a 50% grain levy, regardless of frost conditions. She stared at the semicolon. Her mind recalled the freezing nights in the Ashmere records room, mapping out the dead language. "The continuous mandate is a misreading," she said quietly. "The punctuation separates the condition. In a frost year, the grain is legally bound to the local reserves." "Yes," he agreed, withdrawing his hand to allow her physical space. "For 3 years, the Western governors hoarded the reserves, citing Crown law. They starved their own people to meet a quota that did not exist. When your annotated translation arrived on my desk, I sent the royal auditors west." The wolfless woman felt the breath catch in her throat. She had sent those corrections in secret. A quiet rebellion against bureaucratic incompetence. She never imagined the parchment would reach the sovereign himself. "Your translation dismantled their legal defense in a single afternoon," the king continued. "Because you noticed a semicolon that a dozen high-born scholars ignored, the storehouses were unlocked. 3 border packs were fitted before the first blizzard hit." The silence that followed swallowed the vast expanse of the hall. Mara looked from the cold iron of the slab to his face. He was not looking at her with the dismissive arrogance she had endured her entire life. He was looking at her as an equal. She let that knowledge settle into her like cold water into stone. Slow, thorough, filling every crack. "I did not bring you here to punish you, Mara," Kaelan said softly, using her true name for the first time. "I brought you here because the realm is rotting from within, hidden behind forged contracts. I need a justiciar of oaths who answers to the truth, not to a pack hierarchy." He gave her the full geometry of the room, the freedom to breathe, to choose. "I offer you a formal position in my court, complete personal safety, a private workspace in these archives, full autonomy over your research." He held her gaze. "Will you help me read the rest of the stone?" She looked at the ancient treaty, then at the steaming cup of tea, and finally at the sovereign, who had built a bridge of absolute truth between them. She simply nodded. The library of the Winter Court smelled of dry vellum, melting beeswax, and centuries of undisturbed silence. High above, the vaulted ceiling disappeared into deep shadows, while the tall leaded glass windows offered nothing but a view of falling snow against a pitch-black sky. The cold northern wind battered the stone exterior, sending creeping drafts through the microscopic fissures in the ancient masonry. Mara sat at a massive oak table near the center of the room, surrounded by scattered scrolls and the heavy, fractured pieces of the foundational stone decree. The temperature in the great hall had dropped significantly since the sun went down, but she had not moved from her wooden stool in hours. Her focus was entirely consumed by the archaic runic script etched into the cold stone, her quill scratching out rough translations onto fresh parchment. She had meticulously organized the broken slab into 3 distinct linguistic eras, cross-referencing the border grammar with a towering stack of preliminary tax ledgers Commander Garrick had procured from the lower vaults. The freezing air exacted a quiet toll. Her knuckles, already stiff from the long journey, were turning a pale, bloodless white. Black ink stained the tips of her fingers, drying into the cracked skin. A sharp draft swept across the floor stones, and a faint shiver racked her shoulders, causing her pen to hesitate mid-stroke. She did not stop working. She had spent enough of her life learning to ignore physical discomfort when her survival depended on her clerical utility. In the Ashmere Pact, complaining about the cold was considered a weakness of the wolfless. Here, she assumed it would be viewed as an unacceptable distraction. Across the vast expanse of the room, Caelan Thorne sat at his own desk, reviewing a stack of territorial decrees. He had barely spoken since leading her to the workspace, occupying the room with a disciplined quiet that demanded no performance from her. He did not ask how she felt. He did not hover over her shoulder to inspect her progress. But when another harsh gust rattled at the glass panes and Mara's hand trembled enough to smudge a line of wet ink, she heard the scrape of a heavy wooden chair pushing back. She stiffened, immediately reaching for her sandshaker to blot the ruined text, expecting a reprimand for her clumsiness. Caelan did not approach with a reprimand. He moved with the unhurried grace of a sovereign who had nothing to prove, his footsteps practically silent on the woven rugs. He stopped just behind her stool. Before Mara could turn to apologize, the heavy weight of a fur-lined cloak settled over her shoulders. The garment smelled faintly of cedar and ozone, the crisp, clean scent of the high northern mountains. It was thick and immensely warm, carrying the residual heat of the Alpha King's body. Caelan did not let his hands linger on her shoulders. He did not lean down to breathe in her scent or whisper any possessive claim. He simply adjusted the heavy wool so it covered her shivering arms, acting with the practical efficiency of a commander, ensuring his most valuable strategist did not freeze at her post. "The eastern wall always leaks air when the wind turns," Caelan said. His voice was low, devoid of pity, and perfectly level. "Keep it." He turned and walked back to his desk before she could even formulate a refusal. Mara pulled the edges of the cloak tighter around herself. The warmth began to seep into her bones, steadying her trembling hands. It was not a gesture of entitlement, but a tactical calculation to keep a scholar functioning. She let the silence of the library resume, her ink-stained fingers gripping the quill with renewed stability. As the night deepened, the massive hearth at the far end of the hall burned down to glowing red embers. The only light remaining in their section of the library came from a single, thick beeswax candle sitting between them. They had moved the fragments of the old treaty to a smaller reading table, working side by side to decipher the dense, legal syntax of the Western border agreements. The stillness of the room amplified every sound. To avoid waking the echoes that lived in the vaulted ceiling, they kept their voices pitched to a hushed, pragmatic register. "Look at the third character in the second sequence," Mara murmured, tracing the deep groove in the stone with the uninked end of her quill. The Ashmere elders translated this root word as sovereign grant. They used it to claim perpetual ownership of the Silverwood Valley. Caelan leaned closer, his eyes scanning the ancient text. In the dim amber light, the sharp angles of his profile were cast in stark relief. He did not crowd her space, maintaining a respectful, calculated distance, yet his focus was entirely locked on the evidence she presented. "It is a similar rune," Kaelan noted, his voice a quiet rumble that vibrated pleasantly in the cold space. "But the suffix modifier is different. A sovereign grant requires the blood seal of the presiding monarch. There is no blood seal recorded anywhere on this section of the slab." "Exactly," Mara whispered, her pulse quickening not from fear, but from the rare thrill of intellectual validation. "The modifier shifts the definition completely. It is not a grant, it is a lease. A temporary lease, contingent on annual tithes to the crown. Tithes the Ashmere Pact has not paid in 4 generations. Kaelan looked up from the stone, his pale eyes meeting hers. There was no arrogance in his gaze, only a sharp, analytical intelligence that mirrored her own. They intentionally mistranslated the foundational treaty to avoid the royal tax, while using the false claim of a sovereign grant to collect their own transit tolls from the neighboring pacts. Yes. Mara held his gaze, the heavy cloak still wrapped securely around her shoulders. If they admit the land is leased, their entire noble standing collapses. The marriage contract between Rowan and Eveline. It relies entirely on the combined acreage of that valley to secure their new alliance. Without it, they hold nothing but debt. They built a dynasty on a clerical lie, Kaelan concluded quietly. They sat in the quiet glow of the candle, processing the magnitude of the discovery. Mara realized, with a strange, settling calm, that she was no longer merely a tool for other people's ambition. They debated the legal precedents for another hour, passing out the exact statutes that differentiated a broken lease from outright treason. If it was merely a broken lease, the Ashmere Pact owed staggering back taxes. If it was intentional fraud, they would forfeit all territorial holdings to the crown. Kaelan listened to her arguments with absolute attention, never interrupting, never dismissing a detail as trivial. The candle flickered, the hot wax pooling near the blackened wick. Mara set her quill down, her fingers finally warm. For the first time in her life, the silent stretching between her and another person did not feel like a threat. It felt like a foundation. The following day, Mara relocated to a secure section of the royal archives, a tomb of preserved thought, smelling faintly of dried rosemary and crumbling beeswax. She sat at the long oak table, the temperature of the cold stone floor seeping through the thin soles of her boots. The heavy, iron-clasped cover of the Ashmere Registry ledger lay open before her, its thick vellum pages illuminated by the steady glow of a single tallow candle. For 6 hours, she had done nothing but cross-reference the Northern Border's grain transit logs with the localized tax receipts. She traced a cracked, ink-stained finger down the column of recorded shipments from the previous winter. A discrepancy caught her eye. It was a minor friction in the mathematics at first, a shadow of missing weight. 3,000 bushels of winter wheat had been requisitioned by the local elders for emergency rations. According to the Crown's manifest, the wagons had departed the capital. But the ledger recorded only 1,800 bushels arriving at the Sanctum's storehouses. The margin notes labelled it spoilage. Mara did not gasp. She simply turned the page back, her posture remaining perfectly rigid. She checked the autumn harvest. 4,000 bushels requisitioned. 2,000 arrived, the same tariff code. It was not a clerical error. It was a systematic siphoning of sovereign resources, executed over 5 years, bleeding the king's grain to shadow buyers across the northern mountains. She leaned closer to the parchment, bringing the candle within an inch of the page. The fraud was meticulously hidden within the marginalia, added after the official pack seals had dried. The ink here was slightly newer, mixing lampblack with a cheaper oil base rather than the Crown's standard Iron-Gall. But it was the handwriting that solidified the treason in her mind. Rowan Vance lacked the patience for numbers, and the formal pack scribes wrote with strict, vertical precision. The marginalia, however, possessed a distinct, arrogant slant. The scribe recognized the vanity in the penmanship immediately. It was the same sweeping cursive that had once drafted the petty household mandates, designed to keep a wolfless cousin out of sight. The tail of the numeral 7 hooked upward with an unnecessary flourish. The lower loop of the 9 dragged heavily across the line beneath it. Isolde Grey, Eveline's mother, had not merely engineered a marriage to secure land. The elder had been actively falsifying the records to cover a massive deficit. The Ashmere Pact was not prospering. They were deeply, dangerously in debt to a foreign entity, and they were using embezzled royal grain to pay the interest. An hour later, she stood in the sovereign's private tactical annex. The room was warmed by a massive hearth of black iron, the scent of burning cedar heavy in the air. Caelan Thorne sat in a high-backed leather chair near the fire, watching her with the unhurried, measured stillness of a predator completely at rest. He did not ask her why she had requested the audience past midnight. He simply waited, respecting the boundary of her silence, until she was ready to fill it. Mara walked to the large slate board mounted on the western wall. She picked up a stick of white charcoal. Her movements were deliberate, stripped of any nervous hesitation. "The Ashmere Pact is insolvent," she stated, her voice quiet but carrying the absolute weight of mathematical certainty. She pressed the charcoal to the slate. The harsh, rhythmic scraping echoed through the room as she began to draw. She mapped the central trade route, marking the capital's silos and the designated path toward the northern border. Below the map, she listed the requisition numbers alongside the actual delivery weights. Over the past 5 years, the Crown has dispatched 20,000 bushels of grain to sustain the outposts, she explained, drawing a sharp line through the projected totals. Only half of that supply reached the reserves. The rest vanished between the final checkpoint and the gates. Caelan's gaze remained locked on the board. "Spullage?" he asked, his tone flat, revealing he already knew the impossibility of such a high margin. "Listed as such," Mara replied, turning to face him. "But grain does not spoil in perfectly uniform increments of exactly 1,200 bushels every season. It was sold." She tapped the charcoal against the slate, leaving a stark white dot next to the missing totals. The forgery in the heavy volume was added post-audit. I found the identical ink flourishes, matching the handwriting of Isolde. She has been covering a massive, unauthorized debt by fencing royal supplies to the mountain clans. The king did not explode into a rage. His reaction was a terrifying, controlled drop in temperature. He absorbed the reality of the treason, processing the systemic corruption that had been festering at his borders. "And the marriage contract?" he asked quietly. "A shield," she answered, maintaining her professional detachment. She did not let her voice tremble at the mention of the wedding. By transferring the sovereign-leased timberlands to Rowan's infamily, the elder created a false asset to leverage against the missing grain revenue. "It is a house of paper, sire. The moment the Crown calls for a physical audit of the storehouses, the entire pack will collapse under the debt." Before Caelan could respond, the heavy oak door opened. Garrick Sterling stepped into the annex, holding a sealed parchment tube bearing the Ashmere crest. The guard commander bowed slightly to the king, then offered a respectful nod to Mara before presenting the tube. "An urgent dispatch via Night Rider, sire." From the newly wedded Alpha, Caelan broke the wax seal, unrolling the crisp parchment. He read the contents in silence, his expression hardening into a mask of cold iron. Without a word, he handed the letter to Mara. She took it, letting her eyes scan the frantic, defensive scrawl. Rowan, having discovered that she was working at the capital, had filed a formal petition to the court. He accused her of stealing the registry out of spite to exact revenge for his marriage. At the bottom of the page, a secondary addendum was signed by Isolde Grey, formally warning the Crown that the outcast was mentally unstable, prone to hysteria, and acting entirely out of bitter jealousy. Mara looked down at the parchment. Her knuckles whitened slightly against the edges, but her breathing remained steady. She felt the particular kind of pain that comes not from surprise, but from confirmation. They were still trying to define her reality, still attempting to weaponize her silence as madness. She looked up at Kylan, expecting him to summon the Iron Wardens and crush the rebellion by force. Instead, the Sovereign stepped forward and gently took the letter from her chalk-dusted fingers. "They expect me to execute sovereign authority to silence a thief," Kylan said, his voice a low, resonant hum of tactical anticipation. "They think raw power is the only language this court speaks." He turned toward the hearth, dropping Rowan's petition into the dying embers and watching the edges curl into ash. "We will not silence them. We will invite them to speak." Mara held her posture steady, the chalk still resting in her palm. "You are granting them an audience." "I am granting them a grand tribunal of oaths," he corrected softly, turning back to face her with a look of profound, unwavering respect. "I will summon every Border Alpha to the capital. We will let the betrayers stand in the Great Hall and present their lies to the realm. And then, my scribe, you will present your slate." The iron-hinged doors of the Winter Court groaned against the northern gale, admitting a sudden rush of frozen air and the sharp scent of wet wool into the great hall of stone rolls. From her position in the lower archives, hidden behind a colonnade of dark granite pillars, Mara paused her transcription. The acoustics of the cavernous chamber were designed to amplify every footstep, carrying the sound of the new arrivals directly down into the sunken library. It was the Ashmere delegation. Isolde Grey led the group, her gait hurried and impatient, leaning heavily on her silver-tipped walking cane as she navigated the polished marble steps. Behind the elder came Eveline, wearing a mantle of white fox fur that belonged in a festive banquet hall rather than a sovereign legal registry, and beside the new bride walked Rowan, the former fiancé, moved with the exaggerated, wide-shouldered stride of a man who believed the capital had finally recognized his inherent worth. He adjusted the collar of his tailored velvet coat, his eyes sweeping upward toward the vaulted ceilings, entirely captivated by the architecture of power. He did not look down. The quiet scribe remained seated in the shadows of the lower tier, her quill resting above a fresh sheet of heavy vellum. The desk before her was covered in unsealed documents, with the official territorial tome occupying the center space under the warm, amber glow of a single brass lamp. She watched the delegation traverse the upper gallery, through the narrow gaps between the stone columns. His boots struck the floor with measured entitlement. He was walking directly above the archival bays. The men of the Ashmere Pact always moved as if they owned the ground beneath them, relying on physical intimidation to dictate their rank. They did not understand that in the sovereign's court, true authority resided in the silent, irreversible ink of the registries. The delegation had been summoned under the pretense of a standard administrative review, a routine necessity before any new land transfers could be formalized by the Crown. Isolde was already complaining about the cold drafts, her voice echoing faintly against the limestone walls, demanding an immediate audience with the court steward. Rowan passed right by the open archway leading down to the lower stacks. He did not bother to glance into the dim, quiet spaces where the real work of the kingdom was executed. To him, servants and scribes were invisible machinery, beneath the notice of an emerging pack lord. He looked right through the shadows, completely missing the dark-haired woman, sitting quietly at the center of the archive. She did not shrink back into her chair. She did not avert her gaze. She simply watched him walk past, measuring his puffed chest against the mathematical reality of the forged tax records currently drying beneath her hands. The contrast between his public performance and his hidden financial ruin was absolute. She dipped her quill back into the Iron-Gall ink. The scratch of the nib against the parchment resumed, steady and unhurried. The Ashmere leaders continued toward the upper waiting chambers, convinced they were about to secure a dynasty, completely unaware they had just walked past the architect of their impending indictment. The quiet of the lower archives held for nearly an hour before the sound of descending footsteps broke the rhythm of the room. Mara did not look up from the open ledger. She recognized the uneven, restless tread instantly. Rowan had grown tired of standing in the upper antechamber. He descended the narrow spiral staircase into the archival bays, likely seeking a servant to order a round, or simply pacing off his nervous energy before the tribunal convened. His heavy boots stopped just at the edge of the lamp's illumination, disturbing a thin layer of dust on the stone floor. For a long moment, the only sound was the faint crackle of the hearth fire at the far end of the hall. Then, a sharp intake of breath broke the silence. "You." The word was flat, carrying a mixture of disbelief and immediate disdain. Mara carefully completed the curvature of a legal cipher, lifted the quill, and rested it on the brass stand. Only then did she raise her eyes as the young lord stood on the opposite side of the heavy oak desk. He looked her over, taking in her simple black scholar's dress, the dark ink stains on her fingertips, and the massive piles of crumbling scrolls surrounding her workspace. His initial shock quickly dissolved into a slow, patronizing sneer. In his mind, the rigid social hierarchy had instantly reasserted itself. She was a wolfless outcast, stripped of her Pact status, forced to labor in the dusty bowels of the capital just to survive. He stepped closer, leaning his knuckles against the edge of the table. The scent of his expensive pine cologne clashed violently with the dry, ancient smell of beeswax, old leather, and parchment. "I heard you managed to find work after leaving the border," he said, his voice dropping into a low, mocking drawl. "I suppose organizing old paper suits a woman like you better than the duties of a pack anyway." She looked at his hands. His knuckles were white against the wood, betraying a frantic tension he tried to mask with a slow drawl. He was in the center of the sovereign's fortress, surrounded by laws he could not read, and he was using her to steady his own shaking foundation. She did not answer. Holding her peace served as a perfect defense, requiring no effort yet deflecting every barb. Misinterpreting her quiet restraint as submission, he reached into his velvet coat. He pulled out a silver coin and tossed it onto the center of the desk. The metal struck the hard wood with a sharp clink, rolling slightly before coming to rest against the leather-bound edge of the Ashmere registry ledger. "Fetch me fresh water," he ordered, flicking his fingers toward the dark corridor. "The stewards upstairs are ignoring us, and my bride is thirsty." The request was designed to humiliate, a deliberate attempt to reduce her to a servant in a room where she now held more structural power than any visiting alpha. He wanted to see her flinch. He wanted proof that he had broken her. The scribe looked at the silver coin. It was a standard border currency, stamped with the profile of the previous king, slightly worn at the edges. Then she looked up at the man she had almost married. Her heartbeat did not quicken. Her hands did not tremble with the sudden urge to scream the truths at his face. The space inside her chest simply felt like cold, clear water, settling perfectly still as a ledger for finally balanced. She did not argue. She did not explain her true standing in the court, nor did she point out that the document resting beneath his coin was the formal decree that would strip him of everything he owned. Instead, she reached out, her ink-stained fingers perfectly steady. She picked up the silver coin and slid it deliberately back across the polished wood, stopping it exactly in front of him. He glared at her, adjusting his coat with a sharp tug. "Keep the coin. You need it more than I do." He turned and hurried back up the stairs, leaving the dim archival bay behind, desperate not to keep the tribunal waiting. Mara waited until his footsteps faded completely into the upper gallery. She did not tremble. She did not sigh. She simply picked up her quill, adjusted the edge of the parchment, and recorded his attempt at bribery and witness intimidation in the official court margin with quiet administrative precision. Later that afternoon, the air in the eastern courtyard of the Winter Court carried the metallic sense of impending snow. Frost rimmed the edges of the high stone parapets, catching the pale light. Mara Vale stood near the arched colonnade, holding her notes on the Pact's official ledger against her chest. The heavy black wool of her scholar's dress offered practical insulation against the northern wind. She had stepped out for a momentary reprieve, letting the cold air clear the dust of old parchment from her lungs. Footsteps echoed sharply against the cobblestones. They were not the measured treads of the Iron Wardens, but the erratic clicking of hard-heeled riding boots. Mara did not flinch. She turned slowly, her posture perfectly straight, to find Eveline Grey blocking the narrow archway. The newlywed wore an ostentatious gown of deep, vivid violet, a colour traditionally reserved for the upper echelons of the royal court. The heavy velvet was trimmed in white fox fur, a deliberate display of newly acquired status. Mara betrayed no reaction of surprise. She adjusted her grip on the heavy ledger, her ink-stained fingers resting against the worn leather binding. Eveline stepped closer, her eyes sweeping over the plain, unembroidered fabric of Mara's dress with unconcealed disdain. "Still wearing the same drab wool, I see. I suppose it suits a scribe. It is almost embarrassing to see a former member of our pack looking so impoverished. If you were desperate for coin, you only had to ask Rowan Vance." Silence stretched between them. Mara did not flush with anger, nor did she lower her gaze to the frozen ground. Instead, her dark eyes moved methodically over the violet velvet of Eveline's gown. She noted the stiffness of the drape, the unnatural sheen of the fabric under the grey light, and the subtle, sharp scent that clung to the folds. It was a smell the scribe knew intimately from reviewing import manifests. "The dress you were wearing was dyed with a synthetic, sulfur-based mordant," Mara stated, her tone as detached as if she were reading a line from a tax manifest. "Not crushed sea snail shells." Eveline's patronizing smile faltered. "What are you talking about?" "The colour," Mara continued, her voice quiet and unhurried. "True royal violet is imported from the southern coast. It is stable and costs 3 gold weights per yard. The fabric you are wearing is an imitation woven in the lower eastern ports. It relies on a cheap chemical binder to mimic the hue. If you stand too close to the hearth fires in the Great Hall tonight, the sulphur will react to the heat. The dye will bleed into the white fur, and the entire garment will smell of rotten eggs." Eveline's face flushed an ugly red, her hands clenched into fists, the velvet bunching awkwardly around her knuckles. The illusion of high-born elegance dissolved, replaced by the raw panic of someone whose performance had been meticulously dismantled. "You think you are so clever," the bride spat, trying to loom over the wolfless woman. "You are nothing but a discarded outcast." Before she could close the distance, the unmistakable clank of iron plating broke the tension. Garrick Sterling materialized from the shadows of the colonnade. The guard commander did not draw a weapon. He simply walked into the space between the two women, his armored frame occupying the archway like a solid wall of cold iron. His face was a mask of absolute military discipline, his gaze fixed somewhere slightly above Eveline's head. "Is there a disruption here?" Garrick asked. His voice was a low, resonant rumble that demanded immediate compliance. Eveline took a hasty step back, her aggressive posture collapsing under the crushing weight of the Iron Warden's authority. "Commander, I was merely having a word with my cousin. A private family matter." "There are no private family matters in the sovereign courtyard," the man replied, his tone devoid of any warmth. He turned his attention entirely to the scribe, standing quietly by the stone wall. "Are you unharmed, Madam Vale?" "I am perfectly well, Commander," she answered, her breathing steady. "I was just returning to my desk." Garrick gave a curt nod, then finally turned his cold eyes upon Eveline. He utilized something far more effective than the aggressive body language of a Pact enforcer. "Administrative law. Madame Vale is currently operating under a royal commission to translate the sovereign's old boundary, decree," Garrick stated, reciting the protocol with terrifying precision. "By decree of the Alpha King, her workspace, her person, and her transit routes within the Winter Court are protected under the highest library security protocols. Interfering with her duties is classified as a disruption of sovereign affairs." Eveline's mouth opened, but no words came out. The realization that she held absolutely no power in this space settled over her like a heavy winter freeze. In the Ashmere Pact, her status would have demanded immediate deference. Here, against the machinery of the royal court, her rank meant less than the ink on Mara's fingers. "I suggest you step aside and return to the guest quarters," Garrick continued, with a dryness that bordered on contempt. "The outer courtyards are restricted to authorized personnel." Eveline's swallowed hard, her face pale against the harsh violet collar of her dress. She cast one last venomous look at Mara, but found no victory there. The scribe was already calculating her next line of translation. Without a word, the cousin retreated across the frosty cobblestones. "Thank you, Commander," Mara said quietly. "It is protocol, madam," Garrick replied, a faint, respectful glint softening his stern expression. "The translation of the ancient treaty slab takes precedence." He extended a gauntleted hand, gesturing toward the heavy oak doors of the archive. She nodded, stepping out of the biting wind and walking back into the quiet safety of the stone keep. The grand tribunal of oaths convened not with the roaring of alphas asserting their dominance, but with the heavy, definitive scrape of iron-banded oak doors sealing out the bitter northern winter. The great hall of stone rolls felt less like a traditional courtroom and more like a deep subterranean vault, a place built specifically to outlive the fragile ambitions of the men who spoke within it. High overhead, frost clung stubbornly to the leaded glass of the clerestory windows, casting pale, unforgiving shafts of light across the central mosaic of the sovereign crown. At the head of the chamber, Caelan Thorne occupied silence the way other men occupied speech, without apology, without the nervous impulse to fill it. He sat upon the high seat of the arbitrator, a dark wool cloak draped over his broad shoulders, his posture relaxed but completely anchored. He did not shift. He did not lean forward. He simply watched the proceedings with the terrifying stillness of a compass needle finding north. Below the dais, the witness circle was crowded with the elite of the Ashmere Pact. Rowan Vance stood at the absolute center, wearing a ceremonial tunic embroidered with heavy silver thread that caught the cold light. Beside him, Isolde Grey carried herself with the severe, practiced dignity of a Pact elder who believed that inherited rank alone could bend the mechanics of the law. They had come to legitimize the expanded borders claimed in their recent family union, entirely confident that the Winter Court would merely rubber stamp the domestic affairs of a distant territory. From her quiet station in the shadows of the secondary scribe's podium, Mara Vale watched them. She wore simple, unadorned black linen. To the assembled lords and visiting dignitaries, she was invisible. Just another low-ranking archivist, blending into the dark, polished woodwork of the court's periphery. She kept her hands resting lightly on the freezing surface of her desk, her breathing measured, her gaze tracking the physical evidence rather than the emotional posturing of her former family. "The Ashmere boundaries have been legally expanded through my recent marriage," Rowan declared, his voice ringing loudly against the ancient stone walls. He projected his words toward the viewing gallery, clearly performing for the other regional alphas, rather than addressing the sovereign directly. Furthermore, we possess the ancestral deed supporting the Western Timberland transfer. It was recovered just this season from our deepest sanctum. With a calculated flourish, Isolde stepped forward. She produced a rolled document from a leather case and offered it to the Iron Warden, acting as the court's bailiff. The guard took the scroll and carried it toward the high dais. As he marched past the scribe's podium, passing within 3 feet of Mara's shadowed desk, the sudden draft off his heavy iron-shod boots swept the scent of the unrolled parchment directly across her face. Mara did not move, but her mind immediately seized upon the sensory anomaly. True ancestral parchment carried a very specific olfactory signature: the dry, sharp scent of bone dust, cracked tallow, and decaying animal glue. The document the guard currently carried smelled faintly of roasted herbs and damp tannins. It was the undeniable scent of black tea. She let that knowledge settle into her like cold water into stone, slow, thorough, filling every crack. The Ashmere elders had not found an ancient deed. They had manufactured one. They had steeped modern vellum in boiled tea and hung it in a smokehouse to mimic the centuries of decay that true Iron-Gall ink would naturally undergo. It was a clumsy, desperate fabrication. To a lesser provincial court, it might have passed cursory inspection. But the Winter Court of Oaths did not deal in approximations, and Mara Vale did not forget the exact chemical odor of true antiquity. From his high seat, Caelan Thorne shifted his gaze by a fraction of an inch. He did not turn his head, did not betray the movement to the crowded room below, but Mara felt the heavy, quiet weight of his attention land squarely on her. They had spent the last fortnight in the freezing archives together, unsealing ledgers, verifying boundary lines, and speaking in low, measured tones over maps that predated Rowan's bloodline by centuries. Caelan knew her tells. He saw the slight white pressure of her knuckles pressing against the dark wood of the podium. He saw the sudden, absolute stillness of her breath. He did not speak to her, but he did not need to. The silence between them was an agreement. Wait, let them commit to the lie on the official sovereign record. Isolde Grey continued her performance, her voice echoing off the leaded glass as she pointed to the forged scroll now resting in the Iron Warden's gloved hands. This deed, Isolde announced, clearly dictates that the Western Timberlands and all resources within were promised to the Vance bloodline upon this recent union. Rowan nodded in solemn agreement, standing with his chest pushed out, playing the role of the honorable new patriarch perfectly. He looked entirely convinced of his own manufactured nobility. He did not look toward the scribe's podium. He never had. He had spent his entire life looking past Mara, seeing only her quiet restraint and mistaking it for empty obedience. That was the kind of invisible she had become to him, and it was the very reason he was about to lose everything. Mara reached beneath the freezing desk, her fingertips brushing the heavy, protective canvas wrapping of the true ancient treaty slab. The broken stone roll was cold, solid, and undeniably authentic. She simply kept her hand resting against the cold stone, waiting for the Alpha King to give the command. Their forged deed would fade into obscurity, but the stone would outlast them all. At a subtle nod from Caelan, Mara drew the true ancient treaty slab from beneath the desk and set it firmly upon the polished oak of the high arbitrator's podium. Beside the ancient stone, she opened the cracked leather cover of the Ashmere Registry ledger. She ignored the Alpha Lords, whispering in the shadows, keeping her gaze fixed on the texts. The parchment smelled of old dust, dried pine sap, and the metallic tang of winter air. Across the circular floor, Rowan and Eveline stood frozen in the witness circle. The vibrant crimson silk of the bride ceremonial gown seemed suddenly garish against the unforgiving grey stone of the sovereign court. Mara turned carefully to the exact date of the wedding. Her fingertips brushed the dried ink of the vows. The very words she had personally recorded while standing in the freezing gallery of the Ashmere Sanctum. The oath specifically pledges the white pine timberlands. Mara read aloud, her voice clear and carrying to the furthest stone pillars, offering them as permanent collateral to clear existing territorial debts. She paused, letting the statement settle into the cold air. Holding her peace had always been her greatest shield. For years, she had worn it to survive their mockery. Today, she wielded it as a blade. Beside the open ledger rested the heavy fragment of the archaic border stone. The dark stone was etched with the original runic boundaries of the Northern Territories. The scribe ran an ink-stained finger over the deepest groove. However, the geographical coordinates cited in the marriage oath rely on a deliberate mistranslation of the fourth western marker, a mistranslation that the Ashmere elders have knowingly upheld for 3 generations. The groom shifted his weight, his boots scraping harshly against the marble floor. "This is a matter of internal Pact interpretation," he interrupted, his voice tight. "You have no jurisdiction to question our domestic ledgers before the Crown." The quiet woman simply turned another fragile page. Internal ledgers do not override sovereign law. The original text of the stone roll clearly defines the White Pine Ridge as an unclaimable buffer zone. It belongs strictly to the sovereign court. By using it as financial collateral, the Ashmere Pact has not only committed structural fraud against their creditors, but they have also leased sovereign territory to foreign entities. A low murmur rippled through the observing lords. The accusation had instantly shifted from a domestic dispute into a formal charge of high treason. Eveline's face lost every trace of colour. She gripped her husband's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the dark wool of his coat. The wealth the new bride thought she had secured was evaporating with every calm, mathematical syllable the wolfless scholar spoke. Mara cross-referenced the registry with the trade manifests she had spent weeks analysing. She read aloud the exact tonnage of timber illegally harvested, the precise amount of silver coin accepted from northern enemies, and the specific dates the illicit transactions occurred. She presented the mechanics of their corruption without a drop of malice. It was a flawless, surgical dismantling of an entire noble house, executed entirely through the undeniable alignment of ink and stone. The atmospheric pressure in the hall became suffocating. Rowan's aristocratic composure fractured completely. He took an aggressive step toward the dais, his hands curling into white-knuckled fists. "This is absurd." His voice cracked, echoing sharply. "Are we truly listening to this? Look at her." He threw a hand toward the podium, his face flushed with the desperate panic of a man watching the ground vanish beneath his feet. "She is a wolfless scribe. She was dismissed from our pack because her mind is fractured by petty jealousy." He turned wildly toward the observing council, seeking any ally in the shadows. "She is my former fiancé. This entire audit is nothing but the pathetic revenge of a discarded woman. The word of an unstable outcast means absolutely nothing in a court of law." Mara did not flinch. She kept her posture perfectly straight, allowing his frantic outburst to contrast violently with the irrefutable reality of the documents. Before the betrayer could speak another word, the temperature in the room plummeted. Kaelan stepped down from the shadow of the throne. His movements were unhurried, silent, and terrifyingly precise. The Alpha King occupied silence the way other men occupied speech, without apology, without the nervous impulse to fill it. Every lord in the gallery immediately lowered their gaze, the sudden shift in gravity forcing a collective submission. He walked directly toward the Ashmere delegation, stopping only a few feet from the panicked groom. The sovereign did not yell. He merely gestured with one dark, leather-gloved hand. At his silent command, Commander Garrick Sterling stepped forward. The The disciplined guard lifted the Ashmere registry ledger from the podium, carried the heavy book down the stone steps, and held it open directly in front of the accused man's face. "You speak of the scribe's word," the king said. His voice was a low, resonant hum that vibrated through the floorboards. "The Crown does not rely on spoken words, Vance. We rely on evidence. We rely on ink." He reached out, tapping a single finger against the bottom margin of the open page. "This is the financial audit of the border territories, finalized and sealed on the morning of your mating ceremony. Look closely at the authorization line." The disgraced noble stared at the heavy parchment. His jaw trembled. The blood drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin the sickly color of old ash. He recognized the hurried loop of the ink, a mark he had made in a rush, eager to return to the celebratory feast. "Read it," the sovereign repeated, the command soft but possessing the densities of iron. "It is my signature," the terrified man whispered, the sound barely escaping his dry throat. "It is your signature," Kalen confirmed, his gaze locked onto the other man with the unblinking intensity of a winter storm. "You signed the transit ledgers to legitimize your new estate. In doing so, you personally verified the illegal sale of sovereign timber. You certified the debt owed to our enemies." The king tilted his head slightly. "You did not just break the ancient boundary treaty. You formally documented your own treason, and you legally bound your new bride to the financial consequences." Rowan stumbled backward, bumping hard into Eveline, who let out a sharp gasp of horror. They had built their entire future on a foundation of stolen status, assuming the quiet woman in the gallery would simply absorb their cruelty and disappear into the snow. Instead, she had meticulously preserved the truth, handing them the very pen they used to sign their own ruin. The great hall of stone rolls settled into a suffocating stillness. It was not the kind of silence that falls between words. It was the kind that swallows them whole. On the high arbitrator's podium, the Ashmere registry ledger remained open, its fraudulent entries laid bare under the harsh northern light. Rowan Vance stood frozen at the base of the dais, the arrogant flush drained from his face. Beside him, Eveline Grey seemed to physically shrink inside her ostentatious silk gown. They had arrived expecting a chaotic screaming match, where inherited status could outmuscle truth. Instead, they were drowning in the absolute reality of administrative law. Kalen Thorne did not raise his voice. He descended the 3 stone steps from the empty throne, the heavy velvet of his royal cloak sweeping silently across the polished granite floor. He moved with the unhurried grace of a man who held the entire architecture of the realm's justice in his grasp. By the statutes recorded in the Winter Court archives, Kalan spoke, his tone perfectly measured. The penalty for the falsification of boundaries and the execution of illegal land transfers is complete forfeiture. Rowan's knuckles turned bone white. His eyes darted toward the witness circles, looking for an ally, but the other pack leaders deliberately looked away. "I decree the Ashmere Pact's noble charter permanently dissolved." The Alpha King continued, his low voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "The sovereign leased timberlands are hereby reclaimed by the Crown. Your titles are struck from the registry. You will leave this hall with exactly what you have legally earned: the massive regional debt hidden within your own marriage contract." Commander Garrick Sterling stepped forward, carrying the ceremonial Ashmere Pack staff. The heavy length of dark ash wood, bound in tarnished silver, was the physical symbol of their territorial authority. He presented it with a crisp bow. Kalan took the heavy wood in both hands. He did not look at Rowan, nor did he offer a final monologue. He simply braced his stance and brought the ancient staff down over his knee. The sharp crack of splintering wood echoed like a gunshot. The sound was definitive, irreversible. Kalan dropped the 2 broken halves onto the cold stone floor at Rowan's feet. The silver bindings clattered against the granite, a hollow, metallic death knell for a family built on stolen prestige. "Escort them out," Kaelan ordered quietly. The Iron Wardens moved in immediately. Rowan and Eveline were directed toward the heavy oak doors, their presence rendered irrelevant. Mara watched them go. She felt no vindictive euphoria, only the quiet, settling weight of a complex equation, finally balancing out. As the doors thudded shut behind the exiled couple, the atmospheric pressure in the great hall shifted. The lingering tension dissipated, replaced by the low, steady warmth radiating from the massive hearth fires. The gathered lords remained securely in their witness circles, their attention reorienting toward the dais. Kaelan walked toward the arbitrator's podium, stopping at the base of the steps to look up at Mara. Reaching beneath his dark cloak, he produced a small ancient object. It was the sovereign moon ring, forged from cold iron and set with a single northern moonstone. It was the oldest legal seal in the territories, meant only for the king's chosen equal. A collective breath caught among the observing elders. To present the ring was to formally offer half the realm's authority. Kaelan ascended the steps until he stood beside her. He did not project his alpha aura to compel submission. He simply held the ring out, the cold iron resting securely between his fingers. "The architecture of this court requires truth," Kaelan said, his voice dropping to a private register, meant strictly for her ears. "I do not offer you a cage of gold, nor a bond forced by biological mandate. I offer you a partnership of law, a shared governance. If you will take it." He was giving her the choice. The most powerful man in the realm was waiting for her explicit permission. Mara looked down at the ancient band. She let the reality of it settle into her chest like a stone dropping through still water, slow, thorough, filling every crack of lingering doubt. She did not need to check the faces of the audience to see if she was allowed. She extended her hand toward him. With quiet reverence, Kaelan Thorne slid the sovereign moon ring onto her finger. The cold iron warmed instantly against her skin, and the moonstone caught the ambient light, glowing with a steady luminescence. Kaelan's shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch, a faint exhalation of relief escaping his lips. He kept his calloused hand closed gently over hers for a brief second, entirely respectful of the physical boundary she had just lowered. "Garrick," Kaelan called out, his voice projecting steady authority once more. "Bring the sovereign registry." The commander moved swiftly, bringing forth a massive volume bound in white winter leather. He offered Mara an ornate, gold-nibbed royal quill, but she gently shook her head. Reaching into the deep pocket of her dark scholar's robes, Mara withdrew her own writing instrument. It was a simple, unadorned iron pen, the exact same pen she had used to record her own humiliation in the cold gallery weeks ago. She dipped the iron nib into the glass inkwell. The familiar scent of pine resin and crushed gallnuts rose in the cold air. With deliberate, unhurried strokes, she signed her true name onto the sovereign decree. Ink dried faster than tears in the bitter northern wind, binding her identity permanently into the highest legal architecture of the Pact. She was Mara Vale. She was the royal Justicia. She was the sovereign queen. When she finally set the pen down, the silence that followed was no longer a weapon used to erase her. It was a profound, respectful quiet, honoring the space she had claimed. Kaelan stood beside her, his presence a steady, unyielding fortress of warmth, and for the first time in her life, Mara walked out of the shadow of invisibility, knowing she had built a sanctuary that could never be taken away.